We have Waikwa Wanyoike now on the line. Waikwa, good morning.
Good morning, Eric.
It's good to have you on the show. Asante sana for joining us, and sorry for the earlier technical hitch. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Okay, we still will have some issues. So, Waikwa, you wrote the article that I just quoted in 2007, and you were looking back into the first 5 years of the Kibaki presidency, and you felt that Kibaki was of 2007 was not the Kibaki who was elected in 2002. What do you think of the Kibaki that left office in 2013?
Um, First of all, I just want to start by that I wrote that article just before of 2007. Turned out to be a very a lot of electoral malpractices not. But to your question about Kibaki who left in 2013, my opinion is it's mixed because there is no way I would be able to assess Kibaki after 2007 without actually having to assess his entire tenure. Yes, there are quite a number of things that I think Kibaki did right. Siti Muga was just talking about the constitution and his campaign for the new constitution, but there was also a lot of things that Kibaki did wrong, even after 2007, the signing of the accord, and even after the constitution. And in fact, I think the best way to assess Kibaki is to assess him, at least in the context of his presidency, is to assess him in three periods. The period between 2003 when he became president and what happened, the period around 2007 to 2008, following post-election violence, and then the period, and importantly, the period after 2010 when the constitution was passed. I think Kibaki's worst failures were before and after 2008 during post-election violence and his first tenure, and I can explain that a bit more. I think he did relatively well after the national accord was signed, but he still had failures. And then I think he did again relatively well post 2010 after the new constitution. Although we should also not misrepresent history, he also had his failings, including his own violation of the constitution.
According to you, Waikwa, what characterizes violation of the Constitution? And because you've spoken specifically about 2008 and maybe some of his worst failures happened there, but then now a Constitution which he championed in many respects, how would you say then that he then went against the same one?
I think it's important to be able to put Kibaki's violation. Remember, when Kibaki came into power, we already had, and that is 2003, we already had a constitutional process going on, which was spearheaded by the CKRC, the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission. And the CKRC and then later Bomas drafted a constitution that was believed is what Kenyans wanted. And that was at the time that the constitution was drafted in 2004, Kibaki was president. And what happened in 2004 after the constitution, or Bomas delivered the constitution, Wako, the Attorney General for Kibaki, and obviously, I believe with all the blessings of Kibaki, took that draft and they decided to mutilate the draft and developed what was referred to as the Kilifi draft. And it's the Kilifi draft that was brought to the referendum in 2005. And if you look at the changes that were effected, a lot of those changes were changes that were extremely suspicious, including changes that seemed to go completely against what people had proposed. So for me, that was the first failure of Kibaki when it came to the Constitution. There is another failure that should not be forgotten during his 2002-2007 period. Remember, when Kibaki came into power, part of the reason why the 2002 elections were billed as free and fair, and in fact, up to today, I think they're still billed as the free and the fairest Kenyan elections, is because of the efforts that had come up based on IPPG, Interparliamentary Party Group, that was mooted sometimes in the 90s and was negotiating minimum reforms during Moi's time. And one of the critical changes that, or minimum changes that IPPG came up with was the reconstitution and the recomposition of the Electoral Commission. And what happened then was that political parties, including the opposition, were allowed to nominate candidates to be part of the Electoral Commission of Kenya, as it was called then. And at that time, we didn't have a full complement based on the Constitution of the number of commissioners. So what Moi did was to just top up, and we ended up with a full number of 21, and naming, I believe it was 10 commissioners who had been proposed by the opposition. And it's that spirit, or it's that commission that actually delivered the 2002 elections. What happened when Kibaki came into power? Of course, there was the natural attrition within the commission. People's term coming to an end, and I believe maybe some leaving the commission. And instead of Kibaki using the IPPG consultative spirit of appointment by making sure that those appointed to fill the new positions were considered to be representative of the both sides of the political divide, Kibaki just started doing unilateral appointments of the commissioners. And what marks this as one of the significant violations is in 2007. People should not forget that a significant number of commissioners, I believe 15 out of 21 of the ECK were appointed in 2007, and some of them very late. I think the first batch was appointed in January 2007, and the second batch in October 2007, when we were having elections. And none of those were through consultation. And finally, and I think extremely important, Kibwitu, who was the chair of the Electoral Commission, his term did not get renewed until December 2007. So for me, you see somebody who is trying to take the advantage of the law very early on and he was a competitor in 2007, to be in a place where those who will be judging elections are people who either have not had enough time to familiarize with processes or people who would be seen to be friendly. And 2007 problem partly came about, and people need to read the Kliger report because of that lack of credit.
Let's take a break at this point, and thank you very much, Waikwa. Just stay on the line. We're going to take a break at 26 minutes to 8. Waikwa Wanyoike, a constitutional lawyer. We are looking at the Kibaki years, national cohesion, the rule of law, and everything else. What was happening in the Kibaki years, giving this open analysis of the legacy of President Mwai Kibaki, who is lying in state at the National Assembly for people, the members of the public, to go and view the body and pay their final respects.
This is the Situation Room.
Waikwa Wanyoike, constitutional lawyer, is our guest. He joins us via video link. Waikwa, you talked about the first 5 years. You looked at, for example, what was happening in the Constitution Review, the Bombers talks soon after Yashpal Guy's report had come out, and the Bombers talks, the fallout of Bombers, taking us into the referendum. There was also something else that was happening alongside the Bombers conference, and this was the conversation on the president's health and the politics around it. There are those who were close to the president then who are saying that there are people who, knowing the president's state of health, were keen on getting power through the back door, or trying to force themselves to have more authority and get some more power. And specifically, it is the people on the NAK side who are accusing their brothers and sisters on the LDP side. Was this merited?
Whatever political machinations were happening within Kibaki's government and kitchen cabinet, I'm not sure I can competently comment on that, but I do agree that when you're the president, you're supposed to be in charge and you become responsible for matters of the state, matters of governance. And even unlike today, in that era, Kibaki had a free hand in terms of the processes of how he could hire his members of cabinet or other senior government officials. So if there was anyone who was obviously undermining or trying to sabotage his readership, then it was incumbent on him to take action. And again, why I find sometimes this conversation difficult is we are willing, and I'm one of them, willing to credit Kibaki for the good things that he did, including, we've been told, he did very, very well on economy, as well as other issues of governance. But whenever it comes to his shortcomings, then we revert to the question of his health. I think we have to be objective and say either Kibaki was fully in charge, and so we credit him for the good things that he did and the progressive things that he did, including shepherding the process of a new constitution after the National Accord was put in place and campaigning for it. And at the same time, also be willing to criticize him for the various, and there were many, that his regime endured. And I was just talking about constitutional violation. Beyond even the pre-2007 and pre-2010 violations, there were also other violations that Kibaki, constitutional violations that Kibaki committed. And so we would also be, we should be allowed to also question that record of Kibaki and not just the record that seems to have been positive.
In as much as some of these things that you're speaking of, Waikwa, could then present a stain on the image of the presidency of Kibaki's 10 years in governance, do you see a situation where some have said, I mean, we've seen some editorials today that have essentially said more than just a blight, but there would be an obliteration of the work that the 10 years of Kibaki's government actually did because of some of the things that stand out that were negative, post-election violence being one of them, some corruption scandals being some more, and things like that. Do they obliterate the work having been done, or do they just remain a stain on the presidency?
I don't think they obliterate his positive record. I think what the conversation is or should be is, what are those things that Kibaki did right and what are those things that he did wrong? And remember, part of the reason we engage in this discourse is so that future president, including the president who comes into office following August 2000, this August election, know that people will be vigilant about their record. They will commend them when they are right and they are doing things right, but they will also not fail to criticize or record for historical purposes the things that they do wrong. So for me, it's not a question of obliterating, it's a question of acknowledging and putting history into context. I find one of the most difficult part of this conversation, because I think in a way there has been more positive or rendition of positive image of Kibaki and the positive things that Kibaki did. But I find that part of the difficulty of the conversation is because of the context the conversation is happening in. The context is Uhuru and Ruto's presidency, which has been a failure and a disaster, whether it's on the issues we were talking about of constitutional violations. And so when people are judging Kibaki, I think to a large extent they're using Uhuru and Ruto's marking scheme. And if you're using an Uhuru and Ruto's marking scheme as your marking scheme against Kibaki, of course Kibaki will be seen to have done much better. But Kibaki, and this needs to be acknowledged, he did have his significant failures. Do remember, two standouts following the 2010 constitution that are similar to the failures of Uhuru in relation to violation of the constitution and the court order. The first one is obviously the manner in which Kibaki went about appointing a new Chief Justice, a new Attorney General, and a new Director of Public Prosecution without consultation and without a meritorious process. And that had to be, or the court found that to be unconstitutional. Luckily, and to Kibaki's credit, he did agree with the court and he did not interfere with the new process when the new processes started. And he had a free hand in terms of appointment of the reappointment of the Attorney General. So, of course, he failed, and he was that was the first act of violating a new constitution, or a significant first act. But the second one, which is hardly talked about, following the recommendation of the individuals to go to the National Land Commission, Kibaki failed, and in fact, I think refused to appoint those people. And it took going to court again for orders to be issued that Kibaki had to perform his head of state duty of formal appointment of the commissioners. And he was given 7 days to do that. Even then, he failed. And it took later negotiations, not necessarily compliance with the court order, to honor that requirement. So yes, Kibaki had his ups, but he also had his significant downs, and we haven't even talked about his failure in terms of national cohesion.
Waikwa, let me ask you this question, because this is something that I also grapple with. I mean, where do we draw the line? Is it that any presidency under constitution such as the one we had previously and the new one is limited in operationalizing what needs to be done? Or is it that when someone becomes president, we then have a glimpse into what the person really is like? And so what we're saying, we can find excuses and talk around it, but in essence, we are seeing the thoughts and the processes that this person would like to see put in place operationalized. What are your thoughts?
CT, that's actually a very good question. For me, when I reflect on the presidency of Kibaki and his performance, I wonder whether, in fact, there was any contradiction in Kibaki, even on some of the things that people will find ways to excuse him for. And the reason I say maybe there was never a contradiction, maybe what we got from Kibaki, both the positive and the negative, was always the Kibaki, is because when you go back on his record, when he was either the vice president, or he was minister, or he was in KANU, I think you can see certain markers of his ideological position. And yes, some of those relate to economy and his performance on economy. But the others, and for me, the negative one, is I think he had some dalliance with the concept of imperial presidency. And I did talk about his refusal to share positions in the Electoral Commission, even when there had already been a precedent which he had benefited from, and which he had actually proposed names for appointment of to the Electoral Commission when he was in the opposition. But when he came to power, he was not willing to consult or to share that aspect of power. So there are questions about whether he actually was supportive of an imperial presidency concept. Again, Kibaki survived in both Kenyatta, one, and Moi's government very, very well, even though he had to leave Moi's government, but very, very late. And we all know the record of both Jomo Kenyatta's government, and especially when it comes to issues of violation of rights, and Moi's government. And in fact, when you look at Kibaki's government's record, there were significant violations of human rights, including during his tenure, the culture of extrajudicial killing. And the fact that he's the presidency, we have to attribute that record to his record. So, for example, during that period, we saw a lot of extrajudicial killing, and I'm talking about the period from 2003 all the way to 2012, 2013. Some of the reports written by leading human rights groups, including Lokotuas, on extrajudicial killing, relate to that period. We saw, for example, the excessive use of state power in 2008 during the post-election violence, and in a way that could not be explained. So then the question becomes, was part of this Kibaki actually showing us his true colors, or what he actually always believed in, that concept of the African president who is the be-all and end-all.
If you were in a position such as the one that the president was in, he's inheriting and trying to transition the country from, the 24 years of Moi rule and the previous years of Jomo Kenyatta, and into this, ushering the country into this new way of thinking, new way of going. How would you have struck that balance? For instance, you talked about the human rights violations, and we even had the UN rapporteur on human rights coming into the country to investigate the extermination of Mungiki. You can see the context of what's happening in the country at the point. You can see the mushrooming and the growing of this ragtag sort of militia that is wreaking havoc across the country. How would you deal with it in a way that is both decisive for the sake of national security and also for cohesion? Is there a place for contextualizing each of these things that appear to be blots and seeing, is this a president who is sanctioning, or is this a president who is struggling with the demons of trying to balance between what's right and what's wrong?
Yeah, I don't know that one can excuse significant violations, including killing. And when you're in government, we're not talking about a vigilante group, we are talking about government. Government itself sometimes acting as a vigilante group through extrajudicial killings. When you have, for example, other instruments of justice, including the judiciary. And leadership, of course, governance is hard, and some of these problems will always arise. But the fact that you face a difficult situation does not mean that governments are allowed to take the easy road, and which is what extrajudicial killings have been about. It's government taking the easy road. But also, let's not fool ourselves. Extrajudicial killings, or that culture, has also been used to target people who have been thought to be anti-government. And so where is the balance? And that's why some of us will always insist on due process of the law, regardless of who is involved. And talking about transition, and Eric, you know, for me, probably the most significant failure of Kibaki is the potential he inherited, and that is what my article that you're reading is talking about. The potential inherited for reform, the goodwill he inherited in 2003 to steer the country in a new direction, and how he squandered that. So was it really necessary for Kibaki to take the road where he just exercised unilateralism, when in fact his presidency was born of multilateralism, of different political parties, different significant political actors, including at the time Honorable Raila Odinga. Yet when you get into government, you surround yourself with a cabal of people who seem to just say yes to you. But more importantly for me, from a perception level, and I think also substantively, you are seen to be favoring one part of the country over the other, when in fact you had been put there by a government of what I would call national unity. We've never seen a situation where one politician is supported in Kenya by all manner of individuals and political leadership from all parts of the country like Kibaki did. But more importantly also, the goodwill that Kenyans had in 2003, and part of that goodwill was intended to steer the country into a much more nationalistic, much more cohesive state. Yet, in a lot of ways, I think Kibaki failed that test. And 2007, 2008 violence was the true evidence that he had failed that test. So I would want to judge Kibaki based on that. The potential he had, the country had given him when he came into power, and what he did with that potential and goodwill.
Thank you very much, Waikwa. Waikwa Wanyoike is a constitutional lawyer. He's a friend of the show. He's speaking to us, looking back into the Kibaki years, saying, look, let's judge Kibaki objectively. Let's see, what did he do with the power that he was given, with the goodwill that he was given by the people? Yes, as we look at all the good things that he did, can we draw lessons from some of the failures that were also experienced during his time?